And this panel will be led by Dr. Frankie Wong, who you also heard an introduction from Dr. Bowie earlier. But Dr. Wong is a Mackenzie and Dode professor of health equity research and founding director of the Center of Population Science for Health Equity at Florida State University. And today we'll be joined by panelists Ayer, Suyemoto, and Kham Moua. And I'll let them also introduce themselves when they come up to present. But our first panelist presenter today will be Mia, and I'll join me in welcoming her to the stage. Yeah, I'll just share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Okay, and I can just click. Beautiful. Should I use the microphone, or is it okay if I don't use the microphone?
It would help with the
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mia. I am Policy Manager at API Health Forum. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to the Lotus Project, RAMS, PHI for hosting and organizing this. It's awesome. And to the amazing panelists from SEARAC and NAAPIMHA. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be with you all today. I am a federal policy advocacy kind of person at heart. And so being with researchers and folks who are doing the work I'm a bit starstruck. It's awesome to be here. So yeah, I'll just jump in to giving a quick overview of Health Forum, just some history, and then we can move on. But let's see. So Health Forum is the oldest national health advocacy organization working with AAPI communities. And this work really focuses on supporting our national network of CBOs and just making sure that they're equipped to serve their communities. And also we advocate to the federal lawmakers as well. And so, just making sure that we're working towards systematic change for health equity. That's really what we do. So at Health Forum, we really focus on healthcare access, quality, and equity, because as you know, ANHPI populations have long faced systemic barriers to healthcare access, including a lack of linguistically and culturally appropriate care, major disparities in chronic diseases, and the utilization of mental health services, especially. And we know how critical it is for the voices and stories of ANHPI communities to be at the table to ensure that our health needs are not overlooked. So at Health Forum, we are committed to working with federal partners to ensure that the health of our communities remains a central focus of policy change. So I am speaking from the policy perspective, but our community engagement team, which is actually located mostly in California, but kind of virtually all over, leads the capacity building assistance work for our CBOs, including the translation of federal resources, opportunities for funding and collaboration, and sharing visibility federally and to one another. And I can give you a quick overview of what our CBO network. It looks a lot like the NSTSN or NCTSN one, but we are nearly 300 big across 44 states and jurisdictions across the country. So very exciting there. And just a little bit more about our mental health work specifically, our awesome community engagement team has developed resources and surveys for our network, especially the National CBO annual report is super awesome. That will be coming out soon, the latest one. So keep you posted on that. But it's really awesome to see kind of the needs and just the immediate feedback from our CBOs annually there. And the mental health fight only continues to get stronger, right? Especially in the face of HHS cuts to personnel and the Medicaid fight that is looming at the moment. Actually, markup for reconciliation and mandatory government funding is next week. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. And, 4.5 ANHPI individuals are enrolled in Medicaid, and Medicaid is the single largest payer of mental health services in the US. So it's so important that we fight for this. So yeah, just what we're talking about today is certainly top of mind for Health Forum, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with you all in our discussion. So thank you.
And you can move it forward. Yeah, thank you. Hello, I'm Suyemoto. I am the Executive Director of the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association, or NAAPIMHA. Some of you may know DJ Ida. She is 94% retired. And she's my mentor. So the mission is there. Oh, hold on. Move this somewhere else. Okay. The mission of the NAAPIMHA is to promote and redefine the mental health and well-being of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander individuals and communities through trainings, programs, policy, advocacy, and centering those with lived experience. I am a person with lived experience. And I lead with that lived experience in my role at NAAPIMHA. I am a suicide attempt survivor, and I have lived with chronic PTSD and major depression for much of my life. And my recovery story is part of who I am and why I do this work. So I feel like it's really important that we center those people with lived experience, in addition to doing the work in communities, the higher level academic work, the policy work, all the things I'll talk about in a minute. I also work in a suicide prevention space in Massachusetts, so very much involved in that suicide prevention conversation, and am committed to bring that conversation into NAAPIMHA as well. Let's see. Now, of course, since I moved that, this is not moving. Good. So these are our team members. We have, and these include all of our contractors and all the people who work with us. But really, we're a very small team. I'm part-time. Crystal Canary, our deputy director, is full-time. Elizabeth Sweet is full-time, and Ariel Montesir is part-time. So we're basically 4 positions in all the work we do. And then we have contractors and people who work with us, thank God, because we couldn't do it all ourselves. Our board members, we just onboarded 13 new board members. I am so excited. You can't imagine. And these are all people who are amazing, people from all walks of life, people who are counselors, people who are policy people who are, work in suicide prevention, etc. We have over 200 partners. And this is really important to us. And, those partners grow. And it's really important that we have that community. I mean, we're small in numbers, but we need to have a large reach. Yeah. So what do? We do a lot of things. We have culturally informed mental health trainings. We have Achieving Whole Health training, which some people may be aware of that training, Body, Mind, Spirit. It's a wellness training for our communities that weaves in mental health through a holistic perspective. We do mental health first aid training from the National Council with the cultural considerations of AA and HPI folks woven into that training. We are a firm pro site, so it's a 2S LGBTQIA+ program for professionals who want to learn how to be more affirming of AA. Well, in our case, we're focusing on AA and HPI, 2S LGBTQIA+ youth. Right to Be Youth is a bystander training also for 2S LGBTQIA+. We do sessions. We go resource. We have lots of resources on our website. We have programs. We have a youth program. And we have NAAPIAN, which is the National Asian American Pacific Islander Empowerment Network, which is a network of over 200 individuals with lived experience who are AA and HPI, which is, for me, an amazing resource. Because where can you walk into a room or a Zoom room or whatever and not feel like you're going to worry about the stigma you may face having lived experience? So we create these spaces, community spaces, where people can really just be themselves. We have some special interest groups, including one on neurodiversity and healing through the arts. So, there's a lot kind of going on in that space. We do have healing through the arts as something that goes right through all of the things we do. Very interested in the importance of the arts in mental health healing. We do a lot of workshops to CBOs, employee resource groups, particularly in May. We get a lot of asks. We have community-driven policy and advocacy. We track the policy things on the Hill. Some of you may have seen we put out a letter recently and a statement and had 58 folks sign on to it. I think it's 58. Basically talking about the impact that all of the executive orders and all the stuff has had on AA and HPI mental health. And if you're interested in that, I can forward it to you. Just find me. We have a Vote for Wellness initiative during voting time, which basically encourages civic engagement and taking care of oneself. And then there's National AA and HPI Mental Health Day. It's a resolution in Congress. I believe it's going to be elevated again. We'll see what happens, but we're celebrating May 10th, AA and HPI Mental Health Day. And then we do community sponsors support. So if there's when the LA fires happened, in the Maui fires, we were there to support communities. In New Jersey, Victoria Lee, when she was murdered by the police during a mental health crisis, we actually had community engagement circles to help heal those communities. And then we provide technical support and all sorts of things. So that's what we do. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion of the panel. Thank you.
Sure. I guess I'll go up to the podium too. Hi everyone, my name is Kham, Moua. I am the National Deputy Director at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. Thank you to the organizers for inviting us to be part of this. When they told me that presentations were optional, I considered it and then decided not to do it. The Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, we're a civil rights organization based out of DC and with the California satellite office. And that's primarily where we do the bulk of our mental health related work and policy work. As an organization, we were founded in 1979 to help resettle Southeast Asian refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam after the Vietnam War, the secret war in Laos, and the Khmer Rouge. As some of you may know, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the resettlement of Southeast Asian Americans, starting in 1975. And at SEARAC, we use a geopolitical definition of Southeast Asian. So we specifically focus on those folks who have experiences as refugees or who are descendant of refugees coming from those three specific countries, because we believe that the experiences that they have are unique and shape the way that they engage with the country and with the world. There were 1.1 million Southeast Asian Americans who were resettled into the US between 1975 and 2002, roughly. It's the single largest population of refugees ever once resettled into the US at any one time. And the diaspora is vastly different depending on the waves in which they came to the US, along with some of the different challenges that they face. For example, when we look at Khmer families, a lot of them came as single family homes led by women because a lot of the men had died because of the genocide. A lot of Southeast Asian Americans face significantly higher rates of trauma and mental health related issues such as PTSD because of their experiences with famine, with war, with genocide, and just general violence and re-education camps and so on. Today, there are about 3 million, a little over 3 million Southeast Asian Americans in the US. And this population includes some of the highest disparities amongst all Asian Americans, including in socioeconomic disparities like education, income, employment types. But it also includes very different types of populations. The Southeast Asian American population, for example, is one of the youngest populations in the US. If you look at Hmong Americans, of all racial groups in the US, they have the absolute youngest population, where about 71% of the population is younger than 34. For us as an organization, we focus primarily on policy and advocacy, data support, narrative, and technical support for a lot of the organizations that continue to serve Southeast Asian American populations, either through direct services or through community building and policy and advocacy at the state and local level. Organizationally, we work on two key programs that we host, which is our leadership and advocacy training, and then our ED convening that we host for our partners. And a lot of this is really to just build technical support and leadership and pipeline for Southeast Asian Americans as they navigate their work. At our organization, because we're an ethnic-based organization, not issue-based organization, we work on a variety of issues. But at the center of our work is really wellness for Southeast Asian Americans. Which is why we focus on things like immigration, education, health access, mental health access, aging, and one of our cornerstone issues, which is the disaggregation of data for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. I think one of the things that we are most heartened by in the last administration was updates to the Statistical Policy Directive 15, which helped update the federal guidelines for race and ethnic data collection. It's an issue that Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander populations have been working on for over 30 years. It's an issue that continues to be prevalent because we know that when we look at the data for Chinese Americans, it's vastly different than when we look at the data for Filipinos, for Chamorros, for Hmong, for Lao folks. And especially when it comes to areas of health and mental health, it's important for us to have more disaggregated data because when only roughly 1.6% of SAMHSA funded mental health agencies work with Asian American populations, we don't actually really know what percentage of our populations are being served. At SEARAC, that's what we do in a nutshell. I think the key areas of our work are really educating about who are Southeast Asian American refugees, how do we fit within the broader Asian American umbrella, and how do we fight against the model minority myth that continues to sort of impact and shape the way our communities are viewed, and then how do we also push for culturally responsive care that is respectful of the different ways in which our communities engage with mental health and require mental health support.
I guess it's my turn. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to moderate this session. We have about 40 minutes and there are total 6 questions. Of course, I don't have to ask all 6. But I figured that it would be best if we can stick with the time so we can cover as many ground as possible. For me, this is kind of like coming home because my connection with all of you are directly and indirectly. I know the first director of the Health Forum Policy, Ignatius Bao. So I know DJ. And when I was living in DC, I actually have some connection with SEARAC too. So this is really coming home for me. So the first question I would like to pose is our community is very diverse, linguistically, culturally, and everything. For some of you know, especially Jennifer, I actually was born in Vietnam. Okay, so culturally, I'm the 2nd generation. So my mom was also born in Vietnam, but we are culturally mostly Chinese. But I do understand. I mean, I want to share a story, but it will take up some time because I know Toru for the longest time. So when we first met, and there was one conversation he and I talk about, and we will talk about race, ethnicity. And Toru said, "Oh, I have Chinese in me." I said, "Oh." I said, "Okay, could you tell me more about your part of the history?" And she said, "From my mom's side of the family." I said, "Oh, when did they move from China to Japan?" He was that serious, 6th century AD. He has the book. So though in some way we all connected in one way or the other, right? So I may have been raised mostly culturally Chinese, but I grew up in Hong Kong. So I was completely British educated. So my entire background is probably more British than Chinese in some way. But deep down emotionally, I was tied to Vietnam. So identity is so mixed. Yeah. So for that part of the conversation is that how do you go about working with your community that one size doesn't fit all? What is your strategy?
That's a great question. Thank you for sharing about your background as well.
Mhm.
I do want to. I'm just trying to look at like which question.
Number
Is
one.
this the first one?
Yeah.
So I'll start with, I think everyone knows that NAAPIs are the fastest growing racial and ethnic population in the US. So it's incredibly important for our diversity to be reflected in health policy and federal policies. And how we're doing that at Health Forum, really our work is it is two-pronged, is through our community engagement team and policy team. And the policy really relies on the community engagement to directly amplify what we're hearing from our CBOs to federal electeds. And in addition to regularly checking in with our CBOs, our work is to strengthen their connections to each other and make sure their, needs and their work are being amplified. And so instead of kind of casting like a wide net or drawing patterns across, we try to directly amplify, I guess is my answer to that question. And also making sure that our CBO network is prepared for kind of the chaos that's happening right now, creating some sense of predictability as much as possible, I think is important. And yeah, just my role in policy is to be an information bridge of sorts and a megaphone. And so that's kind of what our DC work looks like. For example, like Kham was saying, making sure that instead of telling federal electeds, hey, you should focus on ANHPIs, really giving them the specific data, broken down, disaggregated, of how, mental health impacts different populations and the disparities and how they're accessing services. That's really important for electeds to have. So, I'll pass it on.
I think one way that we do this, and I already mentioned this, is the partnerships. There's no way we could know, all of the needs of our communities without partnerships in different various communities. And I think, we really strive to be inclusive, and it's not always easy, right? It's not always easy to find those communities, and particularly little communities, in places like rural Arkansas. We work with a community, a Marshallese community in Arkansas around our Vote for Wellness, and so trying to locate these communities. I mean, there are big organizations or bigger, organizations that are out there, but then there's lots and lots of communities that are out there that we may not even know about. And so I think, we're really trying to reach out and try to find, because those communities in particular, I'm worried about now, especially mental health wise, right? I mean, we're in a situation that is unprecedented. And I think, one of the things that we do in terms of reaching out to different communities is really listen, go in and say, what do you need? What are your concerns? And how can the PIMA address them in some way, or network, or give you a resource, or connect you to somebody. And in another way, I mentioned the NAAPIMHA network. We have over 200 people in this network of people with lived experience. And, I think as mental health agency, we cannot think about things like policy or even services or interventions without the input of people with lived experience. Because, those are the people that we're serving. We are the people we are serving, if you will. And if we don't listen to that group of people, we're not going to be able to serve them, right? And that network is very broad in terms of, ethnic background and other things. And also realizing that it's more than ethnicity and more than culture, right? It has to do with intersectional identities. Is someone 2S LGBTQI plus, in addition to being, from an Asian American culture? Is someone from a rural community? Did they grow up with community around them? My experience, I grew up in Massachusetts in a white community with good schools, mind you. But I grew up in a white community and didn't have I mean, the only people who look like me were my cousins. So what is that experience is very different than if I grew up in LA, and maybe had community and had those cultural connections. But we're all part of it, right? We're all in this Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander group, and need to realize that we can't assume. We have to listen, we have to ask.
At SEARAC, I think it's not actually too different from what NAAPIMHA does. We listen very closely to our partners, but we also try to make sure that we internally evaluate the equity of the people who are present in our work, who are able to provide input in our policy priorities, who are represented in our programming. And we sort of use a sort of matrix system that's partial based on different types of experiences, identifiers, to try to at least weigh who is overrepresented and where we're missing. And oftentimes where we're really missing people are in some of the most invisible ethnic communities. So for us, it's folks who are from like the Mien community, the Montagnard community, really small ethnic groups that are like maybe 20,000 people, but whose voice still matter and still have an experience that is, very unique to them. And what we've been doing is, trying to make sure that we're cultivating relationships and partnerships across the country and reaching into communities where they're at. It might not be formal organizations, it might be at temples, it might be at informally constructed entities, to try to make sure that their perspectives are represented, and that we are able to take into consideration what their priorities are. I think the other way that we try to make sure that we represent the full diaspora that we serve is by centering data equity in our work as well. And I already mentioned that data disaggregation or data equity is a key cornerstone of our work, but not for us, it's also about centering that narrative with our partners, with broader communities, to talk about data not just as a form of information, but as visibility, as identity, and as story collection. One of the things that we recently did with some of our partners was, when Hmong folks told us that they were really upset that they were classified as East Asian by the Census Bureau, we worked very closely with them to talk with the census team about what identity meant and why it was important that the Bureau itself not serve as the agency defining this population, be it as East Asian or Southeast Asian, and that it was their role to collect and report and analyze data, not necessarily to define who exists in which sort of geographic pattern. And so, for us, a lot of our work is really trying to not just be preemptive, but try to be responsive to the small communities that feel like they're missing within the broader landscape.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your comment and your perspective. A lot of the stuff that you just mentioned actually already touch upon, like question number 2 is about partnership and stuff like that. And I really appreciate about the conversation about data. I don't want to take up much more time right now because we can go back to that particular point about data equity. Because I'm working with all of us data set. That is probably the largest data set actually have disaggregated data. But we are very concerned that when the data set might be gone. Okay, so all of a sudden my team is stopping in the track. But since so I'm going to jump around because I do think that some of these questions is related to the political landscape at this point. So I'm going to jump to number 4 instead of going to. So given the current political landscape, what are some of the ways your organization proactively to safeguard our community? Like what sort of, how do you go about making our community stronger and more resilient?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. In terms of safeguarding and strengthening, there are a lot of different advocacy avenues for that. Definitely, I think the biggest takeaway I'm hearing from national partners at the moment is to prepare to play defense, but not to preemptively play defense, if that makes sense, but just really be prepared. I've also heard from, congressional offices that they're looking towards community to lead resistance. And I know that's scary, but I think it's really important for us to work in coalition to speak out against Medicaid cuts, for example, and leverage our relationships to make sure that AAPI data is included in these conversations so we're not other or omitted completely, which does happen in these conversations. So that's really important. And I think going to the narratives and the stories part, that's super important too, because data disaggregation doesn't sound great, I think, by itself, but it's important to tie it to a narrative. And that's something that I've noticed a lot in advocacy and talking with offices, is that the story is so important, and then creating a narrative is so important. So it's our first priority at the moment at Health Forum to collect stories from our CBO partners and directly amplify those, and also connect them with offices like the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus on the Hill, who is doing a video project currently to collect stories, to connect these data points with faces and names. It's so critical. And also, I want to say how important zip codes are. CBOs and people on the ground have the zip codes. Y'all are the constituents, and electeds care about what happens in their districts. So, it's really important for us to paint what's going to happen, the harms that will happen if Medicaid is cut, and specifically tie that to districts too.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Personally, like when all of these things came down as executive director, I had this pit in my stomach, like, we're going to lose our funding, and what is that going to mean? What's going to happen to our org? What's going to happen to my staff? There was this like sense of panic, maybe, and a sense to protect. Like, well, maybe we shouldn't put that on our website, or maybe we shouldn't do this, or maybe, whatever. Now, that was a phase, and it moved into another phase, which was, what I noticed is that it wasn't that, and we're pretty small, I mean, in terms of the whole big picture, but that, there were whole swaths of, agencies and grants just being like obliterated. And it wasn't unique to an individual. So when we have a MHAT grant, we have a training grant from SAMHSA. And it's slated to be cut in that leaked budget. So we will lose a bunch of money. And so the question was, are we going to lose that money anyway, whether we say something or not? And I think we kind of realized that, yeah, like we need to say something. Like we can't remain silent, even though, that protective thing comes up, like, oh, I just have to get small and stay small, right? Because I want to protect me and the people who work for me and people in my community. But we've decided as an organization that that's not the way to go. We decided to put out a statement it has a fact sheet with all of the executive orders and things and the impact it has on AA and HPI mental health. We decided to keep the things that we're doing for LGBTQIA plus folks on our website, because that's part of who we are. I mean, all you have to look at is take one peek at the website, and it's like, oh, yeah, equity, DEI, whatever. I mean, all of it is right there, and we're not changing that. We're not, and I feel like we have a responsibility to our communities to be the voice, particularly as a national organization. And so, I think, organizing around these times is hard, and not being so afraid you can't move. That's a lesson for myself. And I think, we are going forward. We're trying to find pathways to reconnect with former federal people who, were very instrumental in the work we've been doing. We had before the administration, we had a federal private partnership. We were working on a national strategy for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander mental health. And then, of course, that all got basically exploded, and so we are reconfiguring and trying to figure out how to build a new coalition to really address these needs. So, I mean, it's different, right? It's different when you have your federal partners and you feel like you can really count on them and they can count on you. But it's also necessary right now to think wider and to think outside the box.
I don't have a ton to add. I think for us, it's about really looking at the full ecosystem between both direct service organizations, policy advocacy organizations, and the roles that we play when it comes to influencing government. A lot of our direct service partners right now they're really scared. I mean, I think rightfully so. A lot of them have lost millions of dollars. They've had to cut staff. They are either directly funded by the federal government or they have, federal adjacent funding from states that are also being threatened. And I think for us as a policy advocacy organization, part of what we're looking at is how do we build the infrastructure so that we can sort of keep this ecosystem going so that folks understand what their role is when it comes to working in or trying to push for different policies that may that could be taken to retaliate against them. What we've been thinking through is how do we, as policy advocacy organizations and as base building organizations, provide coverage for direct service organizations so that they're able to engage in policy and advocacy work without having to put themselves too far out there because, as an organization like SEARAC, we don't get any federal dollars. So we don't have to worry as much about the threats that come our way. And so we can provide that coverage for some of our partners who might not be able to have that conversation. And so, what we're looking at is how do we thread the needle and make sure that everyone finds a role that they're comfortable with? And how do we, allow them to make use of their skill set. So for our direct service partners, that's really capitalizing on their zip code, on the fact that they have stories and narratives that we don't have access to. And then on the federal end, and for a lot of our base building organizations, how do we provide the campaign strategies and how do we work with them to inform their clients when they're working with them about how to engage in this process further. And so that's sort of what we've been looking at, is really how do we just build a structure to engage and how do we, build that structure within the Southeast Asian American refugee community, but also, incorporate that to other existing structures.
Thank you. This is an excellent conversation. A lot of it is overlapping, so I'm trying to figure out what question to ask. So, you talk about connecting with the community. So, how do you working with the other community? So, I'm wondering, can some of you share your thoughts about giving all the rapid number 5 rapid changing policy and also rhetoric on a national level. So all this term about DEI, what kind of strategy, but it's not only affecting service organization. I'm at this point I'm actually considering have to lay off staff on my team. Okay, I'm a researcher, right? I just lost a $150 million grant. So just one of many out there. So, and when Jennifer introduced me, she used my new center name. The last one is empowerment, but the center actually initially Center for Population Science for Health Equity. To protect, I have to say I'm not proud. I have to change the name, but I also need to protect my staff. my integrity of the thing. So we can, like my leadership there is to continue to support us. But at the minimum, I think what I can do on my own at my level as director, I change it to empowerment. But we did not change any of the work we are doing. So these are some of the strategies. It's a really difficult conversation, right? Like, as I said, I'm not proud. So, but at the same time, I do have to do it. So how do you advise smaller organization, their bread and butter is relying on this stuff? So how do we go about making it work? And not actually combining question, how do we, bigger organization, can work with local organization to make it work for them?
That's a tough question. Yeah, it's I think context dependent, definitely, and depending on the size of your organization. For Health Forum, we are an umbrella organization, and so we are retaining the equity language. And I think for the partners that are of similar size, we're trying to retain the equity language. And that's the cornerstone of what we do is fight for health equity. And so again, preparing for defense without censoring ourselves preemptively, I think is part of our strategy. And yeah, we're also preparing each other by just keeping each other apprised on what's happening and sharing information, hearing stories of other orgs who have lost their funding, what they're doing, and just to keep in touch with each other, I think has been very important. And also something I found helpful is reaching across kind of tri-caucus like coalition work, so with the Black and Latino communities as well, and working with those organizations, trying to amplify NAAPI data and stories and tying it to the bigger picture as well. For example, children in our country, the reliance on Medicaid from communities of color is very striking, with 27% of Asian American children on Medicaid and 49% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander children, and 52% of Latino and 58% of African American children on Medicaid. So just tying it to a bigger picture, I think, is something we've been doing. But I'd be interested to hear what's.
I have a great staff that has been tracking these issues. We also have someone on our board who keeps giving us the legislative trackers, and so we have a lot of people paying attention to what's going down and trying to document the impact. So that's one thing we're doing. I also think we have to collaborate more, I believe. I mean, and those orgs that have funding that are outside of the federal government, we need to find ways to collaborate with smaller orgs that maybe not, maybe losing their funding. I think we need to have a community response, because each org for their own, some of our orgs are not going to make it. So how can we as a community, both individually and as a community of organizations, support each other? So, we don't lose the whole landscape of support and organizations that we have created over the years. And I feel like, it is a time that the collective nature of AANHPI folks, we need to put that collective hat on and think, okay, yes, NAAPIMHA. Of course, I want NAAPIMHA to survive, but I also want RAMS to survive. I also want other organizations to survive, and it's important. So how do we, as a national organization, even if we can't fund? NAAPIMHA, we don't have a very big budget, and some of it's federally funded. So we're doing funding campaigns and all kind of stuff. But even if we don't fund, we can convene, and we can strategize. And we can also, look for opportunities outside the federal government to collaborate with, because there's so many partners that we have and so many ways that collaboration could look. And I think we need to think about all of those things as we go forward. And really, again, think beyond the traditional ways we normally do things. I think, I'm making things up here, okay? But imagine, for instance, a 10 organization funding thing for a project, or something where you really had a collective, maybe for a particular cause or for a particular issue. Suicide prevention. Suicide is a leading cause of death for our youth. What if we put together a fundraising campaign for suicide prevention with organizations that are doing that, to be able to create, for instance, my dream is to create an AAPI suicide prevention program. So, I'm just thinking that there must be ways that are not the traditional ways of applying for the grant and getting denied and all that kind of stuff, that we can go about this.
I think on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we wouldn't feel comfortable telling organizations how to define themselves. I think there are very real stakes at hand that each organization and entity has to take into consideration when they're talking and branding their work. Just in the same way that when we, work with immigrant communities, we work with them at whatever capacity or level they feel most comfortable, given the current political climate. That said, in some of the coalitions that we work in, we closely monitor diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we've learned through some message testing is that people don't generally oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion when you use the full language. Part of this is that the phrasing of DEI and the abbreviation has become so politically toxic that it's there is a quick response to it. But when we use the full phrase, it tests better and it resonates more with the general public. And I think people also misunderstand what we mean when we say diversity, equity, inclusion. It includes women. It includes veterans. I think part of this is thinking through how the broad phrasing and framing of DEI, affects more communities than just, communities of color or traditionally underrepresented or marginalized populations. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's something that we've been sort of looking at, and it's something that honestly a lot of our partners are grappling with it too, and a lot of them are also rebranding their work and their DEI, and their presentations so that they don't harm their funding streams. And I think that's a very real and personal decision that we don't really have a right to critique, quite honestly. And I think that's probably one of the best ways of working with local organizations right now is letting them be autonomous and define what makes sense for them when, quite frankly, a lot of us are being, threatened in this environment. And I think, for us, a lot of this work is about how do we not parachute into the localities and the way that they choose to work with their local communities. And, I think the other key thing for us is, as we're trying to build out a strategy, and I say trying to because I think the reality is that federally, we're sort of all grappling in the dark. Like to use a phrase I'm pretty sure everyone's sick of, it's unprecedented, right? And we're trying to co-create strategy. And one of the best ways that we can do this is by being heavily informed by local communities who should be centered in all of the work rather than just the DC talking heads, which is what it has been for the last 10 years and which clearly has not worked.
I'm looking at the time. The next 30 minutes, 20 minutes is going to be devoted to Q&A and then 10 minutes to network. I just want to ask my panel member, do you feel that we have at least covered all 6 questions to the large extent? I want to make a comment and I'm going to open up to the floor. One thing that I have observed is we are doing a lot of work, but I don't think that the bigger US community know we are here. We don't have the national image or presence. So think about what can we do using public media, like say when those of us that are in the scientific field, when we got hit, we got written up in the Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Times, what have you. I just feel strongly that we need one or two clear messages and then use public media to push our agenda so that they know who we are. Okay, when you talk about like data equity, what have you, data equity is very, very sanitized and dry. So what does it mean about data equity? Okay, so people need to be able to understand. So I don't have a solution, but I'm just thinking out loud, right? What can we do to identify one or two clear messages, then collaborate with our media colleagues? Any questions?
Answer that.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we answer question
Sure,
6?
yeah. Yes.
About,
Question 6, can you repeat the question?
all right, I'll repeat the question and I'll
Yeah.
pass it to you. How to care and support your organization's staff, self-care, and how to prevent burnout? Because I think we're all facing that right now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I was just gonna say, personally, I can only speak personally because I don't really manage our staff, but being in community and being in with the people I love is definitely. But I'd be curious to hear what you're doing.
I feel like, I feel as organizations, we need to be leading with that compassion in a way that we maybe haven't in the past. There's so much to do. There's so much to do. And my staff can't do everything. And so part of it is being able to say, literally say, how are you? And if you need time, let's figure out how to make that happen. At NAAPIMHA, we do check-ins at our meetings, and they're body, mind, spirit check-ins. They're not just, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm okay, whatever, not real. They're real check-ins. And when someone is struggling, we had a young woman whose father died recently. We rallied. Everyone took a piece of her job for a while. So I think it's really an important time, not only for self-care, but for community care. It's really important to be able to say, as an organizational leader, what am I doing to support my staff and what am I modeling? How am I, this is like, our work was burnout work to begin with. You add these layers on top of it and it's seriously burnout work. So I think that, trying to figure out not only what you can do for yourself, but also how we can do it in community, like you were saying, because it's actually much more powerful, I think, sometimes in community. So, at NAAPIMHA, we create spaces that are, academic and webinars and blah, 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 but we also take community spaces. Our NAAPIMHA network has a community space that's open. We just hold space, and people show up to talk about how they are. So, I think we need to think beyond the traditional, check-in, how are you? Okay, let's get to work, and really think about how this is affecting individuals and communities.
So data equity is a dry term, but data disaggregation is even more dry, and no one understands what that means. So that's an improvement, at least there. That's what we heard from younger folks. I think on the issue of media, I think one of the things that we've learned over the last year is that we just don't have a ton of media reach. And then one of the other major capacity constraints is that a lot of reporters are being fired. Like the newsrooms are shrinking. And so it's become tougher and tougher for folks who cover Asian American beats to cover our stuff, quite frankly. I think in all the conversations we had in communication spaces and with people who are, covering Asian American issues, mental health issues, what we're hearing is that it's just tougher and tougher to get organizational coverage, to get issue coverage, and then to also place threads. And so, it's limited the way in which we're able to do our narrative work. I think one of the things that we're grappling with, and I think it's probably a broader issue within some of the progressive spaces, is how do we make use and strategize around alternatives to traditional media. and quite frankly, I'm a bit too old these days to have that answer. And so, where it's not something we have a good answer to. I think on the issue of wellness, at SEARAC, we place a large emphasis on wellness for our staff. It's something that's become more apparent now than even in the past. As an organization, we have a 32-hour work week as standard practice, with an understanding that our staff are expected to work weekends and after hours because we're in DC and we do policy work. But we also, try to make sure that we allow for flexible time for staff so that they're able to move their schedules around as necessary. And to accommodate this, a large part of what our management team does is really narrow down on the core components of our work and think through what our role is and what our value add is to our funders, to our partners, and to the elected offices that we work with. I think we can try to be everything for everyone, and that doesn't do anyone any good. And so for us, it's really been about narrowing our work and focusing on where we provide the most value add. The other thing that we've been really thinking through for wellness is staff safety. A lot of this is partially organizational safety, right? How do we make sure that the organization can remain sustainable? That if there is an executive order around nonprofit organizations, like, how do we work around that? But also, how do we make sure that our staff are safe in an environment where they could be, targeted or doxxed? And so we've done things like scrub a lot of digital presence for our staff. Like we've taken down everyone's bios, headshots, just to make sure that we can protect our team if anything happens. We're trying to think through and get input from all of our teams, particularly our gender non-conforming staff or non-binary staff, about how they would feel most safe in the organizational spaces, because part of their day-to-day job includes doing congressional lobbying, which is a space that currently is extremely toxic to them. So, that's sort of what we've been thinking through and trying to figure out. So I think that's how we look at wellness at the organization is, how do we first protect our staff? And then how do we make sure that they feel safe? And then how do we make sure that people we're bringing into the city feel safe too? And part of this is also talking through immigration status with the folks that we're bringing in. So anyone who's not a U.S. citizen, we'll usually give them some sort of, like option to opt out. Basically, we're within 100 miles of the border. If you're a non-citizen, just be aware that there's been targeting of LPRs and other and non-U.S. citizens, and please use your best discretion, right? So that's sort of how we're looking at things.
I want to interrupt this because I was thinking too about at NAAPIMHA. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how to create a trauma-informed organization. Using Sam's 6 principles of trauma-informed practice, because I think, since that's part of what we're talking about, right, is trauma and trauma-informed. I think organizations, not just healthcare organizations, but organizations in general, can think about these practices and think about how to incorporate them into their work.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience.
I'm just going to run this mic back and forth. So good afternoon, I think. Not quite good morning. I'm Elizabeth Chang, and I have a few comments, and I know that I'll be speaking to you later this afternoon, but something that's really, really important to me that I didn't really put into my presentation, but I want to ask the panel, call it out. What exactly is really our problem these days? Racism, racism, and racism. I want to ask you, how do you feel when, where, safe to talk about that? White supremacies. It's just what it is. Call it out. Because me, 55 years in this country, it hurt. This is my country, and I'm not being kicked out. My great-grandfathers fought the Second World War, flying tigers, protect my countries. How dare that I'm not belonged? So please
respond to that. As agency, as communities, how can we address racism, white supremacies? I'm sorry if I offend anybody. They're wonderful, great people too, but they're quite frankly come to me and say, Elizabeth, thank you, because I didn't think about that. I have white privileges I did not even know. It's so natural. Those days back home, right? 50 years ago in Hong Kong, China, they went to missionary school. That's what we were ingrained, indoctrinated, that we are inferior. That's traumatic for us. So please address that as agency to what extent that we should. I don't really care. I just lost $3.5 million. I laid off 6 staff. I care. But we cannot stop, right? Could you address that? And together, I know the collaboration so far, I'm all colors and no colors. But I'm proud of my Asian heritage. Please address the racism issues, down in your practice.
I feel like I'm talking too much. But I actually have been a equity trainer for over 30 years. So and I bring my dissertation was on the ways that it was on anti-racist curriculum, actually. And I feel like we have to talk about racism. We have to talk about the model minority and how that plays in racism. How this idea of pitting us against other groups, like, oh, you're the model minority. Oh, okay, you're not. So I mean, this whole way that dynamic gets played out, and this was not our doing. We didn't say, okay, I'm the model minority, but I think that it does affect. It affects our ability to connect with other groups. It also affects people, with that internalized racism in themselves, thinking, okay, I can get the benefits of being the model minority as long as I'm a good Asian, right? As long as I'm good and follow the white supremacy rules, I get to play in this park. But we know that that turns to yellow peril, COVID, whatever, in a second, right? So, I mean, I really feel like we need to think beyond, it's a black-white binary in this country. A lot of times people think of race and we drop out the middle. But we don't. We've been part of these movements for a long time. We've been part of the civil rights movement. We've been part, and different. And so I feel like, yes, we do have to call it out. We have to, at NAAPIMHA, we were working on a Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander centered equity training. We had to drop it because we didn't have, because we had no funding for it. And it was too much, taking up a lot of time. And, we have obviously some fires to put out right now. But I am committed to going back to that. Now, what would it look like? I don't know if any of you have been to like DEI trainings, but mostly it's black-white. We're out the center, and if we centered Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander experience, and that's not meaning leaving out other people. It just means the thread, right, goes through our communities and the racism that we've experienced. My father was interned during World War II. I grew up with that visceral understanding of oppression. So I think, I think we do need to call it out, and I think we need to not be afraid to call it out. Because I think sometimes we remain silent because we think, oh, we're going to get reprimanded. Well, we might get reprimanded. We might. Probably will, particularly now. But we have to be brave.
I can add just a little bit. No, I completely agree. We have to call it out. And I think I'm thinking back to, I came from the Hill, and my old boss was the first Chinese American woman elected to the House of Representatives, and Judy Chu, is one of the champions. I think there are a few champions at the highest levels of government who will say this is ugly, this is racist, and it harkens back to some horrible times of our country, and we're just repeating history. And we really have to make sure that we're staying in touch with those champions and making sure that they keep representing us that way and in press conferences saying like, this is racism, outright. We've seen this before. This is not new. So I think that's something that we can look towards and fight with. Thank you for your thoughts.
I don't think I have anything different to add. The only thing I'll say is I think part of this is expanding the conversation. I think racism is a really big component of this, but I think clearly this administration has other ideas and other people that they hate. And I think what we need in this moment is not just to call out racism, but to sort of broaden the umbrella of who we're bringing into this conversation by calling out homophobia, by calling out ableism, amongst the just gamut of things, right? I think the other thing that's worth thinking about too is that, part of this current political climate is also like some weird backlash to equity as a concept. And I think, we should call it out. And I think we should also think through the narrative frame in which we're calling it out in certain spaces. So when we're doing some of the political work in Congress, we should say it and also think through how to frame it and when to say it and where it makes the most impact. So I think it's a yes and sort of piece. I think it's part of what we've seen in the DEI space and the DEI conversation is yes, we should keep talking about DEI. Yes, we should keep saying diversity, equity, inclusion. Yes, we should center marginalized communities in the conversation. And we should think through who else needs to be brought in, what other experiences should be said, and how we expand the narrative rather than hyper focusing on just one specific aspect that may not necessarily resonate with the broader audience that we have to talk to.
Thank you. Fantastic panel. I'm really glad to hear from national organizations on focusing on this topic. I have a question is about how do you think that your organization can help in mobilizing the AAPI population? We are diverse. We come from so many different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, bring in different types of trauma. And we're also new, relatively new. Certainly we have long roots, but many of the last generation, a couple of generations of immigrants are predominantly Asian American, and we're new, we're diverse. But we also, it's hard to organize. But I think through COVID-19, we have seen that when the community is facing challenges, that also galvanize the community organizations to think about innovative ways to fight, so that we see that anti-Asian AAPI hate now have a survey of incidents report. We see that C100 committees now have a tracking of the alien land laws. So I think the community can be mobilized to work together to fight and keep track of data. And I also want to mention the funding. We know that federal funding is a problem and more troubles to come. But what about the philanthropical funding? We know that AAPI philanthropical organization reported that for every $100 of philanthropical funds, only 20 cents goes to AAPI organizations. So how to organize the community and how to make funding coming from this organization? That's my question. Thank you.
I think mobilizing the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community faces some of the same hurdles that researching the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community face, which is that it's expensive, it's incredibly capacity taxing. There are so many different languages. You can't really, with so many people in our communities being like LEP, it's hard for us to actively engage if we're not doing it in language. I think there are coalition spaces that exist that serve as a broad convener. It's not the answer, but it is a component, I think, and a place to start. So, for example, all of us are part of a coalition called the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. It's a coalition of federal civil rights and other organizations that run the gamut from the types of work they do to even sometimes clashing ideologies, and so it allows at least some space to try to coordinate strategy and reach into a broader network. I think you're right that COVID-19 brought a lot of the Asian American community together under one issue. And I think it also served to show sort of the limitations of using the AAPI umbrella. When it really brought Asian Americans together, but sort of left out Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders because it affected them differently. And the narrative was so Asian American focused that when we were talking about AAPI hate, we really just meant Asian American hate. So I mean, I think looking at existing structures and coalitions is a place to start in terms of how do we mobilize. And I'll stop there because I don't think we also have an answer either. I think it's a dialogue that I think all of us have to continue talking about. On the funding and philanthropic piece, that's a question for my boss, so I'll bring it back to her. But I do think one of the things that we are heavily concerned about is that philanthropy may begin to ask our organizations to collapse. I think we have heard that for organizations that the pandemic did a lot, but it also saw a large increase in organizations that provided similar services or similar types of work in similar localities. And so now it becomes a question of, well, in a limited funding landscape, who are they going to drive dollars to? And should some of the organizations that currently exist either merge or collapse? And I think that's a difficult question that no one has the answer to and no one really wants to answer. On our end, I don't have a answer to that, but I do think it's something that is becoming more and more prevalent. Part of the conversation with philanthropy should be that they need to change the way that they're giving money out, moving away from project-based funding to more general operating funds. But the reality is that, they're also being stretched, and charities and philanthropy are also extremely concerned with the political environment and whether or not there's going to be changes to some of their own tax status.
I think in addition to thinking about existing coalitions, we need to think about creating coalitions. And I think one thing we can do at NAAPIMHA, particularly around issues of, AA, NHPI, mental health, writ large, at NAAPIMHA we have a little saying that says, this too is mental health, food insecurity, this too is mental health, not getting enough sleep, this too is mental health, all of the pieces, right? But I think, we are actively working to think about creating a coalition around these concerns. And, bringing together groups that are doing similar work or work, we don't do any direct service. We need the CBOs to become, to join that coalition, to know what's going on there and to be able to respond. So I think, trying to create coalitions, trying to figure out, who we need to be in partnership with as we go forward is going to be really important.
I think I also have more questions than answers as well. And it's definitely something that I will take to my team and my boss to hear what they're thinking about this in terms of funding. And in terms of mobilizing, I agree. It's a language and, culturally competent issue. Translating just information is a good first step, I feel like. But yeah, I wondered this, I'm second gen, I guess second gen Japanese. Like my mom came over here when she was like 25 and she's like, why are you Asian American? You're Japanese. Like what the Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander label just like completely goes over her head. It's like my whole life. And I like try to talk to her about it and it doesn't resonate. So I think that's something that is probably pretty common. So I do have questions about mobilizing as well. Any other questions?
Hello everyone, this is Maria from Asian American Center of Frederick. So my question is basically, as the panel discussion is on uniting their resilience, so I was wondering like what are the local community rules or how the local communities can help to be part of this, as you said, like strategies for improving trauma-informed care from national AAPI organization. So I am from Asian American Center of Frederick, and we have a couple of community health programs. But as I joined this organization, and I am from Afghanistan, like we have some people in our community that are calling us for some mental health, but we still don't have that mental health programs. And I was wondering, okay, how, if you're just working on these strategies, how this local organization can be involved? Is there opportunity for them to be involved? Because, okay, you all are talking about like these opportunities, these strategies, but as based on my experiences, based on my observations, local communities know the people better. So I was wondering if I can get a clear answer on that.
I think this is your question. My question. You're talking about the connection, how do, if I understand correctly, it's how the national organization should actually work with the local community.
Yeah, definitely. It's yes, we are here to just amplify your work because I say we as in like federal orgs doing federal advocacy because we really don't have any real idea of what's happening in localities and that's because they're the experts in their own lives and experiences, right? And so we have to just listen and make sure that also not to overburden with questions but ask as many questions as possible. I think your question was how local boards can advocate or sorry, could you repeat?
How local organization can be part of these strategies that you're talking about.
Yes, yeah, and how to mobilize. So definitely, we try to do this at Health Forum through network nexus calls. So just having large calls of bringing people together to talk about. I think that's the first step in involving folks who have the bandwidth to do the advocacy portion. I think it's important for us, like I said, to be an information bridge. So just to amplify what y'all are doing and also bring people in. So in October, we have our national conference called Voices, and we bring as many people who are willing to come across the country into DC and have just a huge networking, hi, how are you kind of convention. But also we go to the Hill and we have people who are doing the work sitting in those offices telling their stories, and that's such an important part. So that's something that we do annually. I don't want to take up too much time with what we do, but
a question: do you guys still do training, the Hill training?
yes, we do.
So one thing I would suggest that for those of you hear about the national organization the first time, get on the listserv so you can get information. They do national training how to talk to folk. I benefit with the Okura Foundation. So I actually was in the room with Senator Inouye. So I got to know about some of this politics, what have you. But it's important to connect yourself first to the national network first. So
Yeah. I was just gonna add from a CBO point of view about how to connect because we have to working with we do work with the Health Forum and also NAAPIMHA. So one of the things as a CBO, we're direct service. So one of the things that we really lean on and really build on like the strength of what they're doing is they have had a lot of webinars getting on their listservs. They record webinars too and send it out so you can listen to it later on. There's just so much things that are happening. And also I think so it's really helpful to build on each other's strengths and then learn from each other. One of the kind of more concrete things also is sometimes when we have a question, the national networks will introduce us to another CBO who might be able to, and they're connected to, they have a network that can make the introductions around that. But I hear you also about speaking about how you have community members that are coming to you that you don't have like the mental health workforce yet. And so it's a little bit separate, but there's also like mental health peer training and other type of I think you're also community health workers. I remember that. Yeah. So I mean those are like the stepping stone or those are the bridges that can happen too. So I don't know if that helps.
Ray Michael Bridgewater, President, CEO of the Assembly of Petworth. We concentrate around health and technology. And one of the things that we did when the organization was formed from a grant from the Kellogg Foundation 25 years ago was to look at health from a global perspective instead of from a local perspective, because the country has a mass amount of people. So you cannot look at health from a racial perspective. You have to look at it from a global perspective. So we're very collaborative and partnership organization. We look at public-private partnerships structures. I think some of my questions you have already really addressed, because it's coming down to a collaboration aspect and build a bigger tent and bring in more partners in that structure. And that's something that we have done. We've done several major health initiatives in the DC area in prenatal care, cancer, diabetes, and asthma. So one of the things I know this is around mental health, and mental health is extremely important, and all our projects concentrate around have mental health as an underlayer of what we do. We have projects around the country and overseas as well. So we're here to partner and to look at ways of how we can partner not only here in the DC area, around the country and overseas as well. One of my questions would be, as we're looking at mental health, what are some of the other health challenges in local communities?
Can I respond just really briefly to that?
And I think we'll just do 5 more minutes and transition into lunch. Yeah.
When I think about trauma being part of our global context and having, if we think about from the adverse childhood experiences study and the research that has been done across 20 years close to now, and we're thinking about, what we know about trauma is that 3/4 of the population has experienced at least one significant traumatic event.
Absolutely.
And what we also know, I'm guessing Dr. Bowie is going to get to this in regards to trauma and chronic stress and toxic stress, it impacts every aspect of our health. And so some of you spoke to this reality of from your mental, spiritual, emotional, right? Like the physical, like us as human beings, where our health is impacted. as a result of trauma. So your question, I'm like, it impacts everything is my very brief response, but I wanted to give some context to that.
I mean, I think, yeah, when we think about trauma, certainly, I mean, I kind of submit that anybody who's from a marginalized community has experienced some kind of trauma, some kind of way, and that as a as a field, if you will, or as a collective, that we need to be thinking about how that gets played out on different levels, and the impact that that has on not only our communities, but also, on individual cultural perspectives. I mean, I would say that, those experience, just from my personal experience, my father who experienced the internment, I would say all those people who experienced the internment and their children have the impact of that intergenerational trauma. And so as we go forward to do our work, I think we have to have that in the back of our mind. Because you're dealing with people who have vulnerabilities that are unseen. And so I think, there's a kind of care that we need to take in our communities. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think it's, but I think there's a way, that we need to be cognizant of things that maybe, we're not right now. And just as an addition to the question about local versus national, I also think that figuring out where the national orgs are and seeing what's on their website is actually a really important thing to do. Our website is chock-block full of resources, like lots of resources, and we have an anti-hate resource that was put together by SAMHSA on our website. We have a resource. We have resources of all 50 states and practitioners, and there's just a lot of resources out there. We have art. Anyway, but I just think that finding the national organizations, and like Angela was saying, like if someone calls the NAAPIMHA and says we need a connection with what, we work really hard to find. If we don't have it in-house or in our partner, we work really hard to find those connections, because we see part of our job as creating those collectives. And I think actually national organizations, that it should be part of our job, all of us, if you're part of a national organization, that it's creating those connections to support those local smaller and smaller and smaller communities that will fall off the map. So anyone else?
I think to the point about our websites, so I don't have health data off the top of my head. Pretty sure there are high rates of Hep B in the Southeast Asian community. But I think for a lot of us, we have reports that should give more perspective and insight about the sort of health concerns that affect our communities. I think one thing that I would like to sort of raise up is how interconnected a lot of the issues and work that we do is, and how it all sort of relates back to wellness, health, mental health. One issue that some of our funders don't think too much about is actually the impact of immigration on mental health, for example. So we work with a lot of folks who are facing removal. They have removal orders. They are getting deported. Part of this is about how do we take care of and treat the health of the spouse that remains and their children, because the children are adversely affected by the deportation of their parents, right? The detention, witnessing the arrest, being part of the removal process, and then also just living without the their generally their father, and then the earned income that that person brings. And then on the flip side, it's also, what about the health and the mental health of the individual who's being removed? So, in some instances, there was a recent case of a woman that one of our partners was working with. She has diabetes. She's now being housed in Laos. She doesn't have access to adequate healthcare anymore. Like, how do we, from a sort of broader perspective, take care of the people who are also being repatriated, and ensure that ideally they don't get removed. But if they do get removed, how do we make sure that we're also caring for them?